Okay, I guess we are live now, right, Fiona?
Yes, we are.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks to my colleagues for joining this conversation. From D4D Network, we are really happy to have this conversation, but also to ask these experts around the challenges, the opportunities about measuring. And when we talk about data for public good, what are the expectations? What's the reality? What's the context right now? And it's a pleasure to introduce you to my colleagues here. First, we have Nicolas Grossman. Nico, it's the project director of the Global Index on Responsible AI at the Global Center on AI Governance. And Nicolas has led the design of a comprehensive measurement framework for a responsible and supervised and expensive data collection program in over 140 countries. He's also a sociologist specializing in research and global measurements on data for public good and responsible AI. And prior to joining the index, Nicolas was the research and data lead for the Global Data Barometer, the GDB, and spearhead the open data and data journalism strategy for Properati, a private sector online real estate platform. And he's completing his master's in political sociology in the National University 3 de Febrero, where he's focused on studying the challenges of big data and AI in less developed countries. So welcome and thanks for joining, Nico. We also have Joseph Foti. Joseph is the principal advisor on emerging issues for the Open Government Partnership. In this role, he leads collaboration and research on new areas of interest to OGP members. Topics include anti-corruption, climate change, civil liberties, and new technologies. He has nearly 2 decades experience leading research and accountability efforts across a range of sustainable development issues. And prior to this role, he was OGP's Chief Research Officer of the Open Government Partnership and leader of the Analytics and Insights team. And before that, he was the founding director of OGP's Independent Reporting Mechanism. Prior to his work at the OGP, he was a senior associate for the Access Initiative, a network led by the World Resources Institute, and a public servant. So thanks, Joe, and welcome. Also, Silvana Fumega is joining us, and Silvana is the GDB project director, the Global Data Barometer. She has served as a consultant for numerous international organizations, governments, and civil society groups. She acted as research and policy director of ILDA until December 2022. Since January 2023, she has been an independent consultant. Silvana holds a PhD from University of Tasmania, Australia, and she also holds a master's degree in public policy from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. In the past few years, she has focused her work on the intersection of data and inclusion. And she's also the co-founder of Data Against Feminicide, a research affiliate at the Data Plus Feminism Lab at the MIT, and a member of the Data Tanks Global Advisory Council. Thanks, Silvana, and thanks for joining. Welcome. And we have also Muchiri Nyaga. Muchiri is Executive Director of the Local Development Research Institute, LDRI, and his work focuses on improving development outcomes for Africans living in Africa. He leads LDRI's food security and governance practices, working with teams, collaborators, and allies to design programs that integrate data, emerging technology, governance, smallholder agriculture, and civil service improvements. With over 26 years of experience in technology, user-centered design, and policy-focused research, Muchiri has worked across various sectors, including fashion, aviation, hospitality, governance, healthcare, and retail. Currently, his efforts are dedicated to helping governments adapt a whole-of-government approach to tackling hunger, poverty, and inequality. So thanks, Muchiri, and welcome. To start this conversation, I will start with Silvana. And Silvana, if you can open up the floor. And my first question for you will be, how does the Global Data Barometer define and assess the public good? I think to start the conversation, we need to start. What are we talking about when we talk about data for public good?
First of all, thank you, Gloria. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with so many friends and colleagues. Not an easy question to answer, but first of all, let me start by telling you a little bit and the audience what we are talking about when we are talking about the Global Data Barometer and how we came about to assess public good. Let me start by saying that a decade after the launch of the Open Data Barometer, the first edition of the GDB or Global Data Barometer was released in mid-2022. Many of the people here were involved already in that first edition. And we did so because as data ecosystems have become more complex, we needed new benchmarks and new ways to learn about them collectively. We know that today data plays a key role in power dynamics. It can be used to generate profit, but also it has the potential, if managed responsibly, to address social challenges, foster collaboration, drive innovation, and many other things. So the Global Data Barometer was created to help us understand and support this potential. That first edition of the GDB provided crucial insights into the foundations needed to build and maintain a healthy and inclusive data ecosystem. This second edition that we're working on builds on that work, tracking the evolution of this ecosystem and exploring key areas such as data foundation for AI, among other cross-cutting topics. In that sense, healthy data ecosystems are not just a theoretical idea, they are essential to addressing today's global challenges. In a world where we know that more than ever, misinformation, disinformation, surveillance, division in communities, threaten democracy, we need a strong and responsible data governance, as well as data infrastructures and capability to better understand what is going on and to face those challenges. The CDB contributes to this effort by evaluating the infrastructure, policies, and strategies that enable effective data management, publication, and use. In this second edition, we also have refined our methodology to highlight positive examples of data use and explore relevant cross-cutting themes as mentioned earlier. The results are comparable and it led us to support better decision-making and policy development. Through this work, what we're trying to do is to promote positive change, helping governments to align their policies with the idea of data for the public good, and fostering healthier data ecosystems that protect democratic values and contribute to more informed society. We know, and it's clear from the report in the first edition, that we know that the concept of public good can be understood in different ways. We know it's a contested concept. So in that sense, the GDB used the Sustainable Development Goals as a shared reference point to identify the public goods that data can help achieve. We know that it's not the only way, but it's a good reference for us to understand what data for public good could mean. In that sense, our approach also is based on some key principles that, for example, data collection and sharing must be governed by legitimate public rules that respect fundamental rights. We also know that governments and communities need a strong capability for data sharing, publication, and use. Also, that high priority datasets should be available, accessible, open, and also interoperable for reuse. And at the end, that is a positive feedback loop between good data governance, data availability, and also the availability of governments and civil society to use data effectively. This feedback loop helps build a strong national and sectoral data ecosystem that serve at the end the public good. Let me just add to that more data or a greater role for data in society does not automatically lead to better society or better data for public good. That for data to create a meaningful change, policies and practices must be intentional. And that is why the GDB does more than just measuring the accessibility of data. It looks at other areas or aspects like governance, capability, and use to track progress and ensure that data is truly working for the public good. In that sense, just to finish this first or this introduction, we are launching the results of this second edition in late May of this year. And hopefully we will be able to help governments and civil society organizations, in particular in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, in fostering healthier data ecosystems that protect democratic values. And we need it more than ever before in this day. So hopefully, the results that we are launching in a couple of months is going to help these organizations that are here with me today, and also governments to better achieve those results. Hopefully that's a good start to the conversation, and we can follow on some other details later.
Thanks, Silvana. And I think you brought like key concepts for the conversation, and I will follow up on them later. But I would like to highlight this importance of the protection of democratic values. Also, the idea that more data doesn't mean better societies per se. And I think here we can put a question in terms of quality over quantity. And I think the specificity of the data, it's also crucial when we talk about public good, and also the connection with the SDGs, how data can help us to achieve SDGs, and also to have better measurement, evaluation, etc. And I will follow with a question for Joe. And my question for you, Joe, would be, how well do existing measurement tools capture progress made on the development and use of data for the public good? How well are we measuring this data?
Great. Yeah. Well, my answer is going to be mixed, but I want to highlight that the Global Data Barometer is one of the best sources for the type of data we need. So for people who are tuning in, it's good to introduce how OGP works and how we use data like the Global Data Barometer to look at the state of data. So OGP is a multilateral, multi-stakeholder initiative, like an international organization. We promote open democratic government. That means transparency, public participation, and public accountability. And that includes opening up government data and making sure there's proper stewardship of that data. How does it work? Well, we have 78 members, each of them at the national level and 150 at the local level. Each of them co-creates with civil society. They co-create an action plan. Those action plans usually cover some kind of policy change or policy implementation. Often these are about transparency of government data. And then there's an independent reporting mechanism which checks the accountability. So the part I want to focus on then is the issue of accountability and change, and this gets to how I would judge the state of data. So it's a voluntary process. We're not a standard setting organization. There are lots of great standard setting organizations like the International Standards Organization or Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. There are many of those. We don't have that. So data about data, like the Global Data Barometer, is absolutely essential for us to be able to make progress. Why? Because like any voluntary process, we have a problem that lots of countries like to join, but they don't all want to do big, ambitious things when they join. They like to, we have a free rider problem, and any voluntary initiative or any treaty has this problem. So how do we get ambition? And one of the ways that we get ambition is through measurement in these core areas. And that's where the question is, how is data for the public good doing? We're really excited to have had such a long-standing partnership with the Global Data Barometer because it's allowed us to measure over time, well, now we'll be able to measure over time, how our membership is improving. It allows us very specifically to give government's advice. So I'll give you a few concrete, quick examples. We were able to use the open contracting data that's in the Global Data Barometer. I was with a group of contracting professionals from a Caribbean country who had very high score overall in the Global Data Barometer. And they said, well, we have a very good system. And I said, I agree. It's definitely the best, one of the best ones in the region. But we were able to drill down with the Global Data Barometer and look specifically that they weren't publishing their blacklist or unperformed contracts or companies that had broken contracts. And that was so helpful because instead of talking in general principles, we said here is a specific data set or a specific set of indicators and variables that you're not publishing, that to have a fully operating system you have to have. So that's an example of a really concrete piece of data that the Global Data Barometer proposed. We don't have that same kind of data in a lot of fields in this in the world. Global Data Barometer has lobbying, it has right to information, has that contracting data that we can't really get anywhere else, and that's really helpful. There's a number of other areas. If we had infinite money and infinite human beings, I would have, Silvana knows, I would have a list of about 15 or 20 more things I would ask for. So I don't want to bore you with that list, but there's some positive things that are going on out there. This approach could easily be replicated across other fields like climate, energy, and I'm sure I could name a bunch of other, all kinds of them that we would love to look more deeply in. But I'll stop there. So it's a mixed bag, but Global Data Barometer for us is an absolute bright spot in that global situation.
Thanks, Joe. And I think what you mentioned, I think it also starts to kind of define the conversation, you know, around public good, but also in terms of the specific data. It's not talking about, previously Silvana mentioned, it's not quantity, and now you bring this need of a specificity in terms of sectors that could benefit the most from having better data, and especially when we talk about data for public good. And here I will continue with Nicolas, because in terms of a specific data and knowing your experience with the GDP and also with the index, what will be your view on how well the existing measurement tools are capturing the progress on how we are measuring data for the public good?
Okay, thank you very much, and hello to all the audience. Well, I think that the question of how well measurement tools are doing perhaps it's a very starting point to think about it, but perhaps it's difficult to answer with a concrete and close question. On one side, I would like to agree with Joe regarding that this measurement of about data that the GDB is doing is critical and is providing a lot of this detailed and granular inputs on the status on the data for public good around the world. And I think, and we have seen different reuses of this data that the GDB is generating, that is being crucial to understand the current status and also to dig deeper in each of the topics that the GDB is covering. And also we see that the GDB also interacts with other measurements, and they are quite complementary in various ways. So for example, with the Global Index on Responsible AI, where I'm working, we know that data is a critical input for AI, and having well-governed, well-managed, and healthy AI ecosystems, data ecosystems, as Silvana was mentioning, is crucial to have healthy, responsible AI ecosystems and well-informed AI systems. So there also we see a great connection, and that is how other measurement tools and frameworks can build on top of the GDB, which we know this is the most important database about data project currently. And also, for example, but not also with that, not only with the project which I'm working now, but for example, if you see the open data inventory, which is other kind of approach to open data, and they are measuring different things within a very similar topic, and also are pretty complementary because there you see the uniqueness of each tool. One more focused on the statistical systems and some standardized data sets, while the GDB is more focused in the whole data ecosystem, not only in the statistical offices, and also providing, as we were saying, very granular and detailed data on each of the topics. And also, just to mention one other, we have the Land Portal Foundation that is also working in measuring in specific how is the data ecosystem in the land field, which also is working with the CDB. But there you have other complement, the general picture with the CDB and comparison between topics, and then you have a more sectoral approach. So in a general sense, I would say if we have to think about the current status of the measurement for data for public goods, I would say that it's a very rich environment, very complementary. Also, there is a dialogue between these tools to give better resources for policymakers and for academic and for all the audiences. Obviously, also, as Joe was mentioning, there are limitations and challenge with these kind of tools. Obviously, the resource and time constraints is one of them. We would love to have for each of the high-pressing topics in the data field, we would like to have detailed information updated every year, etc. But that's not always possible. So we see some limitations. However, I think that we should also highlight the value of these snapshots that we have. Okay, this is not real-time updated data, but this is not the idea. The idea is to have this snapshot at what time, at what moment in this field, and take all the learnings that we can have from that snapshot, and those learnings are valid for a lot of time. It's not just, okay, you release, and because it's not updated every day, it's not useful. You can keep learning from that moment, and then with the next iterations, you can keep learning of, okay, from the things that were done using, informed by that data, what was the effect, what things changed from one moment to another. So I think that these snapshots of state of data for public goods are really, really important and useful for this critical topic.
Thank you, Nico. And I think also in terms of what you mentioned for this idea of having like specific snapshots, not specific times, contexts, moments, it's crucial to understand even the evolution of the sector, but also like maybe the specific needs of that moment, but also the importance to have continuity in terms of having different moments that you can compare, analyze, and see the evolution or even backlash, et cetera, et cetera. I think also that's crucial when we talk about these measurement tools. And something that you also brought that I think it's important, and maybe we can go and talk about it later in terms of the connection between data and AI and the new questions that are arising, how we complement those conversations in terms of, for example, as you mentioned, with the GDP and the index, and maybe in a more colloquial way, I would like to say that maybe for me, the index and the GDP are kind of the two sides of the same coin. I think you cannot have healthy, responsible AI without having healthy, open ecosystems of data. And I think that's important when we think about the future and when we think about this idea of public good. I think that connection and that bridge, it's super important. And I will also like to question Mushiri in terms of the same question that I did to Joe and Nicolas. And I will also would love to hear about your experience. And when we talk about, for example, the Global South, how well are we measuring? What's your experience? What are your takes on that? And how do existing measurement tools are doing in terms of the use of data for the public good? And I think what's your take on that one, Machiri?
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I'll segue that off from the snapshots metaphor that Nicholas has used, because that's I think the measurement tools we have, whether it's a global index, whether it's the global data barometer, or whichever others then they come across. I know the EU has a number of data observatories looking at different things. They are very useful for giving us that snapshot. But I think it always leaves us asking for more because of the need to see whether we are making progress. And that's part of your question. How are we doing on measuring progress? And I think that alludes to a trend, and that second data point then becomes really important, and the third and the fourth become even more so. So that's why I'm pretty excited about GDB2, the second edition coming up, still loading. Silvana, we're over here waiting. And of course, the global index, I think we are hoping for a second edition at some point this year as well. And those second points become really useful for the level of advocacy that we really want to push things to going forward. And I think for us in the Global South, there are areas where I think with GDB and the Global Index, we're doing a little bit better than we did with Open Data Barometer, or I forget the other one that we relied on back in the days. And I think one of the things that we see there is that they're a bit more relevant. The indicators, the themes seem to be a bit more relevant to our reality, our context. So just to give you an example, if you're doing, if you have a GDP measuring, for instance, a significant part of it measuring transit data, our transport systems in many parts of Africa don't have that level of automation. There is not that kind of data. I know researchers are still trying to figure out how Kenya's public sector, public mass transit actually works. How do people know that there's actually going to be a bus, at the road at a certain time? We use sixth sense, and it's not even in the data set. So how do you make sure that the data then that we need on our side of the world may not be as big on transit data, might be bigger on other issues, service delivery, maybe civic space, sectoral issues around agriculture, around land. Nicholas mentioned the land portal. So those things tend to be areas where governments, civil society, communities are really paying attention to. So that's I think we're doing well with these tools at the moment, because they are even at that snapshot allowing us to tell what is available. So if there is data sets, so there are data sets that are not available and they need to be available, then we have a place to start. And between now and the next edition, we get a chance to see whether our advocacy is bearing fruit, whether our leaders are actually taking action, and provides us more evidence to move the needle along.
Thanks, Mashuri. And I think also you explained it perfectly in terms of how well these measurements will work as a starting point to understand where we have to go deeper, what we need, what is missing. And also you mentioned something important in terms of the level of advocacy, and I think maybe, and it's covered in the questions later in terms of, well, what's next? Once you have the measurement tool, how you can promote it, and in terms of how you're gonna have a conversation based on those insights, etc. And I will go back to Joe to ask you one more question in terms of, as with your experience with the OGP and working also globally, what are the biggest gaps or challenges that you're encountering measuring the impact of data for public good or for good? What are you seeing through time and through regions?
Okay, so the biggest gaps. Maybe it's good to explain it. Let me see. So there's obviously gaps in terms of country coverage and subject that we could talk about. And those change over time, right? Like things that might be interesting at one point in time become less interesting, or become, let's say, they become foundational. There are issues that are coming up more and more. I can think in a lot of countries, the question of migration, of course, is important. Financial flows, these are areas, budget credibility, tax, these are areas that maybe weren't central 10 years ago, which is not to say they weren't important, but there wasn't quite as much spotlight as there is now. So the topic changes. But the biggest challenge for us actually comes in, of course, how many countries and how many like these questions of coverage. That's kind of a big question. But then the second set of questions and the big gaps, and the reason why there's a lot of data collection that seems to go into indexes and ranking, or it goes into very thick description of what's going on in countries. And that's not to criticize any of this, but for us, there's a few design components, and the reason why the partnership with D4D has been so valuable to us is that we can look at a few different elements that make really good policy data for policy change across the global south and really everywhere. Number one, is the data collection process scalable or low cost enough that it can be repeated across different places? Closely related, while we don't engage in any ranking, we do need to still have it be comparable. And again, that's where this is quite good, and not all data sources are as good, because the second question we get once people say, okay, great, you've shown us that your work, that we don't have X policy in place, or we don't publish this data the way that we should, they say, who in our neighborhood is good, right? And they want good examples. So comparability is great for learning. And a lot of the data sources we have just kind of don't point us in the direction of being able to say, here's your neighbor and here's why they're good and here's what you can learn from them. Or here's a country that's completely different from you, but they have a very good thing that you can get. That's why GDB has been very helpful for us. The third thing, again, which is a hard part, is a lot of data is produced by civil society. It's not always clear that it's actionable. And especially, actually, I would say less so civil society, more business sector things that are produced, like ratings agencies and these types of things. You can't really tell a government, okay, you're bad on civil liberties in general, and here are 3 policies you should put in place to improve that, right? And that's the problem. A lot of things measure the environment, but they don't measure the policy. And that gets to a fourth thing that is what we love about GDB in particular, is can you have someone explain the data to someone else? Is it legible? And that legibility is just quite often, we live in a world where attention spans are short and there's a surplus of information. And so the question there is, do we have data that it's not just enough that Silvana and I can understand it, right? But then I have to have a coworker who can explain it to a fourth person who then has to go to explain it to their boss, right? And that legibility of data, especially around governance, is rare. And that's something which should be cultivated and should become more of a norm. And it's not used as much as we would like in the broader world. Of course, a value that we all prize also, and where there's a big gap, is on openness, especially in the things we work on in democracy. Economist Intelligence Unit, has all this great data, but we don't know the formulas that go into that data. So if I ever am in front of a room of people, I can't explain why your score is this or why your score is that. That's similar with other great data sets like Reporters Without Borders, very good data sets on media freedom. But again, I can't explain why they got a score. And so that doesn't quite leave me there. Then it's tied to the last one, which is reliability. A lot of the data, can I tell you that the same set of questions were asked in this country and that if it hadn't been this researcher or that expert, that you would have gotten the same results? And that's a big gap. And so one of the things that's been great about this collaboration is that this is one of the few data sets that we have pretty high confidence that we're meeting most of those. Of course, we'd like to cover more countries and we'd like to cover, more topics, but that's for the next fundraising round. But that's where a lot of our gaps are coming in, is that if you want to do policy work and really see if things can get better, they'll better. Sorry, I left off one last of my many components of what makes it good, is sustainability. Repeating measurement is important. And I know that donors and everyone in this world, myself included, like to move on to the next interesting thing. But some of these things are fundamental, like seeing if your country's political finance system is working, and if you're publishing the data and voters know who's paying their politicians for their campaigns. That's just something that needs to be measured over and over and over and over again, so we can see if we're making progress or if we're backtracking or where we're making progress. And too often, people develop beautiful data sets and only have funding for 1 or 2 rounds. And so the hope is, I don't know what the long-term goal is, but it'd be great to have some kind of trust fund or something that was sustainable that couldn't be rated to support ongoing benchmarking across some core public good data sets.
Thanks, Joe. And I love the list, and I think it's super clear in terms of thinking about the gaps. As you mentioned, scalable, comparable, actionable, legible, the reliability of these tools and how we can guarantee that. But also, and I think it came up again, this idea of continuity. It's super hard to do these processes and our projects that take a lot of resources, a lot of time, and a lot of coordination when we want to do it global measurements. And I think also in terms of the priorities, what are the priorities, or for who are a priority? These tools they are super useful, but also in terms of if governments or organizations want to invest in them, who can benefit the most. And I think my next question will be for Nico, and also thinking about, because I know the index works in a kind of similar way, and even it's connected with the network with researchers around the world, with the hubs, and as we work as part of the D4D network, in terms of what role the regional context play in shaping the effectiveness of these measurement tools, and how can we better account for local variations? Because I know that you are also working in different regions around the world. And what do you think about how and local context play a role?
Well, I think this is a key subject of interest for this kind of global or regional project. And one of the main challenges that we have as building these tools with a global coverage and with the intention of being comparable, and also, as Joe was saying, actionable. We need this measurements tool to be comparable in different contexts, different countries, but at the same time, they have to have local relevance. So we see these regional nuances and particularities. We can see them along all the phases of the project, from building the conceptual framework, and so how we are going to measure these phenomena, like data for public good or responsible AI. When we are defining how these concepts, we have to take into account the different regional points of view, and to get from some global, I don't know if consensus is the word, but some guidelines that are commonly agreed between the debate agendas, and get there, to a common sense on something that makes sense in each of the regions, and allow us to build a global comparable tool. Then when you go deeper into methodology, you have to do the same with the measurement framework, with the measurement tools that you are using, and also the evidence that you are accepting. It's the same, the evidence that you're expecting for countries in some regions and countries in the other region. The availability of evidence online, for example, or in the research flow would vary also across regions. So you also have you need this way to find this way of how to address it. When you are analyzing the data also, that's having a focus on the regional particularities. It's critical, because perhaps you want to have, yes, you want the global messages, but you also want the regional insights, and you need to know what the relevant actors of each region is expecting from your product. As these projects cover a lot of topics in the agenda, perhaps some regions are more focused on one of those topics and other regions in another. And that will shape the usage of the tool. We have seen, for example, recently with the Global Index on Responsible AI, that the usage was pretty different, and the reception. Let's do this. Do not take this as how to say, very literally, but in a very initial. This is only an example. We have seen some global north countries using the index to show how well they are doing and how they are leading this agenda. And we have seen some other countries more curious on what other countries similar than my country they are doing. So we want to learn more. So yes, having the region, different levels of involvement in the global data ecosystem and in the global AI ecosystem, and they are facing different challenges. We see how these particularities are shown in all the processes. And I think that here what we can do is obviously take into account these particularities and be ready to address these different requirements, and also to be ready that we, from each iteration, we learn new things from each of the regions. And yes, and I think that more than a challenge, I think this is a richness, something unique of the projects that allow you to start these global conversations with some very common ground, very general common ground, but then you have to be ready to find out a lot of the different things, particularities, interests, and reuses that will emerge in each of the regions that we know that are very different historically, culturally, economically, and in a development point of view.
Thanks, Nico. And I would like to highlight something that you mentioned in terms of the challenge of having local relevancy, but at the same time to be global comparable. No, I think it's relevance for a regional, local context, but at the same time to have the methodology that can create these comparisons around regions, around countries. And as Joe mentioned before, I think country and policymakers love to have references in terms to, if I'm doing really good, I want everyone to know that I'm doing really good, but also in terms of what are our opportunities to improve, etc. So this comparison approach, it's relevant. And sometimes I guess if there's another way, as Joe mentioned before, like to measure data. No, it's not just having an index, having a ranking, having a graph where it shows who is doing well, who's not doing so well, but also in terms of the legibility and how can we communicate the importance of data and the opportunities. I think it's important. And you mentioned that, like, what's the usage of these tools, and that is super connected with regional and local contexts. I think that's also very, very important. And I would like to go back to you, Silvana, in terms of also connecting with this that Nico mentioned, and looking at the state, of what have you seen recently with all the data collection process, and in the previous edition of the GDP, looking at the state of data policy across the world. How can measurement tools like the GDP or the index, for example, can evolve to stay relevant in a rapidly changing data landscape, and what we are seeing right now with everything changing so fast?
Yes. Before going to that, I mean, I start thinking about something that you just mentioned, and referring to what Nico said about rankings, ratings, and those kind of things, and how important it is the local use and advocacy use of those scores, let's say. And one thing that we were really trying to be strong from the beginning was, and Nico knows about this, that we're trying to avoid making the list of rankings, saying who is first, who is the last. I mean, because of the things that you already mentioned as well, that it's so different to compare from one region to the other and so on, that we were trying to position the GDP as a learning tool, something that each country can learn from themselves, where were the gaps, where were the strengths that they can build on, more than saying, oh, we are number one or number, I don't know, 109 or whatever. Because in general, I mean, because we did a global edition, some global figures also hide different different numbers or different ways in which the shape of the state of different topics were in different regions. So in the average, the details were hidden. So that's something that I was thinking when you mentioned that. But going back to how we can stay relevant, I mean, in particular, talking about a tool that is measuring the state of data for the public good. I have to say that particularly thinking about measuring data remains relevant in today's AI-driven landscape. As we usually say, data serves as the foundation or the backbone of AI development. So we need to think about the status of data, in particular public data, to also think about how to approach AI in a responsible way. We do that by examining data foundations such as data protection, sharing, infrastructure. So in that sense, we want to provide critical insights into the progress and challenges of AI deployment across different regions. The other thing that I think is important is that to stay relevant, the GDB continuously evolves. In that sense, I mean, we updated and changed many aspects of the methodology. For example, we are now highlighting bright spots to address some cross-cutting themes, and we are refining the methodology in the second edition based on the lessons that we learned from the first edition. So we know and recognize the need for ongoing adaptation, while also preserving some core elements, because I was mentioned in several places. It's important to be able to compare certain aspects, even though probably not everything, certain core elements should be comparable, so we know how things are moving, forward or backwards, depending on the case. So in that sense, I mean, we need to be able to adapt while also keeping some core elements. In that sense, I mean, the rapid pace of digital transformation also is demanding us that we remain agile. So in that sense, I mean, the shift in the data agenda call a few years ago for new benchmark, and that was the reason that the Global Data Barometer was created after the Open Data Barometer. So we know already that we must adapt to the changes in the field and the agenda, but now we know also that we need to adapt even faster because of the pace that these practices and the technologies are changing. So in that sense, I mean, we need that to stay relevant, we need to keep core elements that were able to be comparable throughout the edition, but also we need to learn how to quickly adapt and adopt things that are relevant probably today that were not relevant a few years ago, and that goes faster by the minute. So I think we learn already how to do that, but we are for sure need to keep doing that in the future.
Not an easy task at all. I think what you mentioned, Sil, in terms of this need of adapting and keeping the core elements, no? What's like kind of the heart of the methodology, the perspective in terms of how strong this tool can measure and can keep pace with the world and the conversation that it's happening out there. And also, I would like to highlight this concept about how important data infrastructures and data ecosystems are for AI. And I think it's something that we don't hear quite often. Maybe here we're working with data, we know the connection, but in many forums that are maybe just focusing on AI, for example, maybe the conversation is not that obvious, or it's not that kind of appealing to talk about data like a couple of years ago. And I think that's super important also in terms of the pace and the needs that we're going to be facing in the next years. And Mushiri, I would like to go back to you with one more question regarding the results of the current measurement initiatives and how they can be, because you mentioned something in your previous intervention in terms of how those initiatives and those measurements can be more easily translated into policy recommendations or best practices for governments or even other organizations working in specific regions, civil society, academia, etc.
No, thank you. I think my observation has been that if you put the results in a language that they understand, and here I'm not talking about necessarily language in the sense of English, Spanish, etc., but in terms of the thematic areas or priorities that they're looking at, I think, you know, my observation that policymakers especially tend to sit up and pay attention. Same thing happens with civil society, the other development partners. So, for instance, these results have issues. This index, the index and the barometer look at areas around enabling environment, for instance, that are really important for moving forward with our development agenda. And a derivative product from the data that is gathered that tries to show a policy maker or a leader the extent to which their current state puts their development agenda at risk or their administration's agenda at risk, kind of translates that document into something that they are immediately understanding in the context of their development priorities or their current administration's agenda. And I think that's one of the things that we have at a subnational level, especially where we've been doing some work around capacity measurement for data. We're getting more traction having those conversations when we talk about that subnational government's development plan. And so what does your data capacity, or lack of your data capacity mean for achievement of this broad array of massive investment decisions that you must make because they're tied to a development agenda, and the success thereof? You know, so I think that for me, that's like one of the big bits that we now need to start thinking about, and that for me connects with the kind of partnerships we're building around work. So I love how, you know, GDB brought together, you know, different sector leaders. We had, for instance, Land Portal mentioned. They did eventually see a governance domain in the barometer in the context of the work that's being done around land. So even when you have thematic specific data points on land, they are in the context of a broader data governance issue. So if the land sector picks that up, they're able to explain it in landlish, in land language, right? To those working in that sector, why these things are a priority and need to be addressed. And it may sound simple, but I think the challenge for a lot of us when we're working on some of these tools is sometimes we don't have the capacity to repackage this into every single sector, every single thematic area. So the conversation needs to be driven by people who are in those spaces. And that's where the development partner conversations, the civil society conversations, the community partnerships become extremely important. So the thematic presence of partners is one of my biggest, one of the things I love the most. And I'm hoping we can do that. And Joe did allude to the fact that, you know, I think it was Joe, I think you mentioned something about scalability around the sustainability issue. How do you do this repeatably over time without having to break the bank? Especially now when we are living in such constrained fiscal space in just about, whether global north or global south, you know, it's like suddenly we realize just how little money there is for anything. So how do you make sure that you can actually nudge resources towards building better data capacity within a specific area? Sometimes the methodology that we put together, because of its rigor, because of its replicability, it could eventually result in partners picking it up and applying it within the context of their space or their geography, with their own specific resources which they're able to pull together without necessarily possibly having Silvana run everything, you know, except to guide and to provide quality assurance, and Nicolas. But the reality is that when we have something like that, people are able to pick it up, use it, adapt it for their context. And that, my view is that that's possibly how we give these things life and legs. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
context and language.
Context and time. No, and I think you also read something super important, and I think it's a part behind these tools, and it's all like the human work, no, the collaborations, partnerships, different knowledge, and working together to understand and also to translate these tools later, as you mentioned. And I love this idea of depackaging, no, depackaging the data for thematic and specific sectors, and I think also it's super important. And obviously, like the idea of the potential of building better data capacities for the future and even for different sectors. And I think that's also super relevant when we talk about this perspective. And if we want to improve and enhance and increase the data for good ecosystem, I think it's something that we have to continue doing. And I'll have a question, and now I have a question for all of you. I don't know who would like to start. It's not an easy one. The next two are going to be in more in terms of the challenges and how we see the future. And the first one is, what strategies can we implement to promote better and more collaboration between tool owners and the integration of their results also to improve data practices? I don't know who would like to go first.
Do you want me to
Super. Yes, Sil.
go? I mean, I just can only talk about the experience of the GDB, but I mean, apart from the collaborations that we already had with not only thematic organizations as OGP and others, and Land Portal, and the regional organizations like ILDA, Aldirag, and many more, we are also recognizing the need or the shared challenges that we have with other measurement initiatives, and we are trying to work on that since at least 2024. And I think Nico already mentioned something like that. So we are trying to think about how to better work on the similar challenges that we have. And we started back, I think it was mid last year, a dialogue group with other institutions, including Nico and the Global Responsible AI Index, but also some other measurements like ODIN from Open Data Watch, the SOLI Index from Land Portal, the Open Data Maturity from the European Union, the World Bank's SPI, and so on, to think and to talk about different challenges that we have. And we learn from like bilateral conversations, informal bilateral conversations, that we were facing similar challenges, no matter how big or small the project or the organization was. So we are trying to do that. We keep doing that. Also as part of the data commitment at UN World Data Forum from last year. And the idea is to organize discussions and conversations, also inviting experts to share some insights and best practices, and also trying to think about how to build some products together. So we are thinking about developing a note on the use of AI tools in the different measurements and why we are doing that and what are the things that we need, for example, from guidelines to internal policies to also thinking about guidelines for external use. And also just to finish that, we also know, and as Nico mentioned at the beginning, that in some ways, I mean, the GDB play a crucial role in shaping other measurement tools that, for example, the Global Indexes on Responsible AI first edition, but also the SOLI Index that the Land Portal Foundation is developing, and it's going to be launching the results alongside the second edition of the GDB, as well as also helping the UNCAD coalition to have more data on interest and asset declarations in Europe as part of their work, and also, I mean, with the tools that we already have. So we know that we need to keep working on collaborating efforts. It's not easy. I mean, in many cases, we don't have the time or also the resources to do that. But I think we found a way to find a space to keep discussing with other teams about the things that we are facing together and finding ways to share good practices. So hopefully in the future we can keep doing that and increase that idea of keep collaborating with other measurement tools.
Thank you, Silvana. And before I give the floor to Joe, Mushiri, or Nicolas, I don't know who wants to go next, I will just add one additional question to this idea of how we enhance collaboration among tool owners, but also another one that is not easy, but I would love to hear your ideas in terms of how to improve engagement strategies, in terms of how to connect with end users. And maybe one of the biggest challenges that we are constantly talking about, how to go outside the technical bubble. I don't know if you have also ideas on that.
Yeah, can I go? Sure. Okay, so on those questions, so as Gloria mentioned at the very beginning, I used to work for the government. Specifically, I was a public school teacher, And one of the things you learn in public school teachers is what good group work looks like and bad group work looks like. And bad group work is where one very smart student goes and does all the work. Good group work is one of the requirements of it is that everyone has a specialized role, right? And they're not all doing the same job. So I think when it comes to this question of impact and collaboration, what we can think about is good group work means that everyone's specialized. Everyone doesn't have to do everything, right? I'm sure we're all above average, and we would all love to run everything, but it's more important that we collaborate through these partnerships and through networks where everyone is a little bit specialized. That getting that right at the beginning, which is again what I've liked so much about collaborating with Global Data Barometer, getting that right at the beginning means that we can then engage later on in a more meaningful way. So, for example, OGP and Transparency International have split up the section on political integrity. And we each have our own networks of hundreds or thousands of people that we work with that are able to kind of guide us and say, that first round that you did, it wasn't quite as useful as it could have been. Here's some tweaks to get it to be better, or we didn't even use this section, let's cut that section later. So that allows for revision and aligning the tool with what professionals in the field do. So that's a first step of making sure that that expert user base is able to use it. The second one is OGP will actually develop a process by which we can use some of this data. And so very specifically, those who have been following OGP closely, we've always had the OGP action plans, which are usually every 2 years or sometimes a bit longer, but they're generally every 2 years. The new idea is to have OGP challenges, which allow different agencies or different parts of the government to move forward one commitment at a time, and maybe in a way that aligns with their particular work cycle. Where that's really exciting is that then we're able to take this data and to take this governance data from GDB and others and be able to tell them, here's where your gaps are, right? This is where your current gaps are. Here's where you could close those gaps by making X, Y, and Z more transparent or publishing data on this or that. And we will be developing tools to help visualize that. If you all haven't seen, from the first round, we built a tool called Broken Links, which had a data visualization that simplified the data. So it was real easy for people to understand. That's been extremely useful. We plan on doing something like that again and even mainstreaming it more. That gets you to that expert user base, that kind of first circle out, right? And it still requires those human connections. Where I'd pose a question for all of us, especially in the context of AI, is how do we get this information out more broadly? And I'm going to be very concrete here. We were requested to do information, to prepare a memo on best practices in political finance by an election management body, election management authority in Asia. Big country, and they said, how are we doing, and where are some gaps that we could publish better political finance data? GDB was still the best source of information, and why is that? And I want to think about what this means for countries in the global south. And this is a large country, right? And this is before we talk about really small countries. When we pointed our various large language models to try to, help answer the question of, does this country publish data? The large language models gave us something that was approximately true, but that was not actually true. Which is to say, they said, in this country, XYZ agencies are all required to publish their assets and their campaign finance data, therefore it happens, right? Because the LLM is basing this all off of, what law firms say and what compliance lawyers are saying, because that's the most predominant text that they can encounter. And so a question I have, and I think that we should think about strategizing, is there a way to get those LLMs to better rely on data like the GDB? Because that is more accurate than these approximate answers that we're getting or the probable answers that we're getting, because in so many of the countries, the text that is available most frequently is what lawyers write or what the government issues through its approximations, which aren't necessarily what's really happening, right? And those are two different things. So I don't have the answer to that question, but I'd love to continue engaging and thinking, because we know that most people don't come to our websites because they come through search engines, right? And increasingly that will be through chatbots or other things. But if we're not getting the right information out there in front of them, I don't know how we do that better and get those chatbots to point towards this data. I think that's the key to the next level of scale beyond those experts, though. And so I would pose that question. There's hopefully more expert people who can help answer that. But in so many of the countries, the media just reproduces government press releases and just reproduces, and the lawyers say, here's what the law is, or here's what the last presidential decree was. And that's not what we collectively have done that's so cool. So I'd pose that question.
Thanks, Joe. I think that's really interesting. Now, Nico or Mushiri, I don't know who would like to go next.
Maybe they can take a stab at it. But Joe does bring up something interesting, which I think might be a missed opportunity currently, but maybe not for long. So yes, the large language models do have a lot of content. That content isn't always complete, but for visitors and people using those models, they don't know that. Even disclaimers on those things don't, they don't disclaim enough, right? So whatever they find ends up being the building blocks of some bigger piece of content. But I think there is a case for taking the work we're doing and working with others to build smaller models, which is currently where a lot of the work is moving to. More specialized tools that are more focused on specific thematic areas. And what happens is the work that's done there, if you open it up, is picked up by the big large language model developers as well, and they use that to improve their models. So there's a kind of a cross-pollination effect that would happen. So on one piece, on one side, that's kind of where I see that being a possibility. Especially now because we're moving into this agent-driven spaces, AI agent-driven space, where people are going to be relying a whole lot more on agents than they are specialized agents even than they are currently with the general ones like Siri. I have a couple of thoughts maybe when it comes to building engagement, and I think for me that does kind of connect back to the conversation around outreach and language, and I think we're pretty on the open gov side. We can tend to be a bit insular. And I was talking to Fiona earlier and saying how one of the things that we found is that we are, as LGRI, we're very interested in working around issues to do with helping subnational governments understand what their data capacity looks like. So how do you measure data capacity in a meaningful way, meaningful enough for a leader to have a roadmap that is costed, that allows them to prioritize what investments they have to make in order to close those data gaps as fast as they can. But then how do you make sure that they're accountable for that? It means bringing that conversation around data capacity and digital governance to spaces where we don't usually take those conversations. So for instance, we do a lot of engagements with smallholder farmers. We run farmer field schools. So we're teaching them about agronomy, a particular crop that they could grow, how they could deal with the post-harvest issues around that, possibly what they could do around the marketing for it. But at the same time, these farmers are also encountering service providers with digital tools, with AI bots, and all sorts of things that are attempting to help them achieve a certain goal. Now we're integrating the conversation around digital governance and data rights into that so that when we're coming to talk to them about farming and crops, livestock, we're also telling them, and when you find these digital tools that could help you, and here's a list, whenever you're using them, please keep this in mind. Please, these are the questions you need to ask providers about your data, about how it was developed, etc. And the hope is that, if you're bringing the conversation around what the government is doing to improve capacity so that they can have better data, and they can understand that that data means whether they will get a subsidy or the right kind of subsidy or not, then there's a likelihood that you have local representatives who are pushing back on their governments and saying, you came to us with a budget because we are doing this participatory budgeting process, but we didn't see any response to your issues around data because we need better services for advisory or better services for a subsidy. And the problem we can't get that is because you don't have the data, you don't have the capacity for it, and it's not in your budget. Are you planning on solving our problems? That's the ideal, utopic scenario that we're heading off into the hills for. And I think the ability to kind of take these conversations and take this content, repackage it in ways that make sense for others, bring that into spaces that we normally don't have these conversations in, I think would be extremely useful. We have big sectors like health and agriculture that have huge investments, and some of them falter a lot. And in many instances, it boils down to a governance problem. Boils down to what they're doing with the data, and are they using evidence, and also extent they're doing that vis-a-vis the political pressure that might be there. Social protection, social health, all these areas are so big and so politicized that I think we're not bringing those conversations, at least in my region. I don't see us bringing these conversations there as much. I think finding ways to plug into those communities, because some of them are very technical, finding ways to engage and plug into those communities so that we do that a bit more deliberately could be one way that we could really build some engagement. And I think there could be a cascading effect in some way, because these sectors are also doing a lot of measurement. And some of the most advanced measurement I've seen is in some of these sectors, and some of those do include dimensions around governance, around evidence, etc. And I think plugging in to that might result in us not just benefiting from talking to Odin, the Open Data Inventory, or Land Portal, or the Global Index, and others. Might mean also, having some input from the communities, like the community around the DHS, I forget, the demographic health survey, for instance. When the whole statistical community, they're working on amazing things. There could be lessons we could learn from those working on the World Bank census stuff for agriculture. I forget what that tool is called. So the cross-pollination, I think, by walking into those spaces and trying to make doing this connection of bringing sense from this data into their sector, could eventually also result in us connecting with other tool owners, learning from each other and improving our products as we go along. So that's a beautiful imaginary world I live in. Won't you join me?
Thanks, Machiri. And last but not least, Nicolas.
Yeah, no, I agree that this question about engagement and dissemination of the products and the output, it's challenging, but also opens a lot of opportunities. I know if we think, for example, in the GDP and the Global Index on Responsible AI, and where we recognize that a healthy data for public good ecosystem and a healthy responsible ecosystem is composed by different actors: the government, civil society, academia, etc. And each of them, they have different roles and different ways to work and different objectives to meet. So we have this main objective to improve these ecosystems, and we need to find these ways to give to each of the key actors the products, the resource, and the languages that they need to use to reuse and to engage with this data. And also, for example, we also highlight the importance of public participation. So in that idea, in that principle, also you need to think about how this data, how this information can we use for public advocacy. No? So we have a lot of work stream to improve the engagement and the dissemination. And I think that one path to explore that could be very beneficial is to identify those, let's say, intermediate actors and that could help us to have these more tailored products and messages to these audiences. Because as we always say, with this, the core or the stable teams or the stable partners of this project cannot by themselves take all the most of the data that is collected, analyzed, because there are a lot of universes that you can explore in each of these topics that these projects cover. So we need to identify those actors that are able and they have among their objectives to use this data and to translate it to concrete actions for different audiences. Obviously, we have to kick off that activities, but we also need to identify who are the organizations or the institutions in the societies that can better do this work.
Thanks, Nico, and thanks everyone, because something that I will keep in mind and what I see here in this conversation, it's the importance and the relevance of more collaboration. And I think in a world where we are seeing that idea, it's challenge in all sectors, and I think having that in mind also give us more of a better perspective in terms of possibilities, in terms of how we can improve data for public good, how we can improve, even as you mentioned, the outreach strategies, language, who are the ones that we are not talking, in terms of looking for maybe intermediaries, as you mentioned, new sectors, new spaces, and the challenge to translate these tools, these measurement tools, as the to-go resources in terms of when people are looking for the state of data or specific data for thematic areas, etc. So I would like to thank all of you. This has been a really enlightful and very enjoyable conversation. Thanks, Nicola, Silvana, Mushiri, Joe. And please keep us posted in terms of all the advancements and the news that we will have around the GDP, news from the index, and also from OGP and LGRI to share with the network, the D4D network. It was a pleasure to share this space with you and to have this conversation. So see you in the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Right, bye-bye.